My name is Jim McAllister. I'm 68 years old, and I never once thought about leaving Texas. My family had lived on that same land for 3 generations. My grandfather was born there. My father died there. And I believed, without ever questioning it, that the exact same thing would happen to me. But it only took a few months for me to sell a ranch my family had spent almost a century building and board a plane to a country where I didn't know a single living soul. If you had met me in that airport, tired, gray-haired, clutching a one-way ticket in my hand, you probably would have thought I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I thought so too, if I'm being honest. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments which country you're watching this video from. I was born in a small farmhouse just outside Lubbock, Texas in 1958. My grandfather, Earl McAllister, bought that piece of land back in the 1930s, during the worst years of the Dust Bowl, when most sane men were running away from West Texas dirt instead of buying more of it. He used to say the land was cheap because nobody else believed it could be tamed. He believed it could. He was a stubborn man, and I suppose stubbornness runs thick in our blood. By the time I came along, the ranch had grown into 400 acres of cattle country, dry, wind-beaten, unforgiving land that demanded everything you had, and gave back only what you earned through blistered hands and sunburned necks. My father, Wade McAllister, took over from Earl in the 1960s, and he ran it the same way his father had, waking before dawn, working until the sun went down, and never once complaining about it, at least not where anyone could hear him. I grew up learning to ride a horse before I learned to ride a bicycle. I learned to mend a fence before I learned long division. School was something you did between chores, not the other way around. My daddy used to tell me, "Jim, this land doesn't care if you're tired. It doesn't care if you're sad. It only cares if you show up." And I showed up every single day for almost 50 years. When I was 22, I met a girl named Carol Whitfield at a county fair 2 towns over. She was there selling pies for her church, and I was there because my buddy Robert dragged me along, swearing there'd be pretty girls. He was right about that, at least. Carol had this laugh that made you feel like you'd said something clever, even when you hadn't. I bought 4 pies that day, just so I'd have an excuse to keep talking to her. My mother scolded me for weeks about the money I'd wasted on pie, but I never regretted a single dollar of it. We married a year later, in a small white chapel 20 minutes from the ranch. Carol wasn't a rancher's daughter. She was a school teacher's daughter, raised in town, with soft hands and a gentler way of looking at the world than mine. But she took to ranch life the way she took to everything, with patience, humor, and an unshakable will that I only came to fully appreciate decades later, when I needed it the most. Carol became the first-grade teacher at the elementary school in town, a job she kept for 31 years. I ran the cattle and on weekends fixed tractors and combines for half the ranchers within 50 miles, because a rancher's income depends entirely on the weather, and the weather in West Texas has never once cared what a man needs. We had 2 children. Our son Wade Jr., named after my father, was born in 1981, and our daughter Emily came along 3 years later. Wade Jr. grew up to become a lot like me, quiet, practical, more comfortable fixing something than talking about his feelings. He stayed in Texas, working now as a project manager for an oil services company outside of Odessa. Emily was different from the start, curious, restless, always asking questions nobody had good answers for. She left for college in Colorado at 18 and never really came back, not permanently. She works as a physical therapist in Fort Collins now, married with 2 kids of her own. I won't pretend our life was easy. There were droughts that nearly broke us. The summer of 2011 alone killed off nearly a third of our herd, and I remember standing in that dead brown pasture wondering if the whole McAllister legacy was going to end with me. There were years the cattle prices fell so low that Carol's teaching salary was the only thing keeping the lights on. There were nights I came in from the barn so exhausted I fell asleep at the kitchen table before I even got my boots off. But there was also a rhythm to that life that I loved, even when I complained about it. Sunday dinners with both kids home for the holidays, Carol's garden, which somehow produced tomatoes even in soil that seemed determined to grow nothing but mesquite and stubbornness. Friday night football games in town, where half of Lubbock County showed up just to watch teenagers we all knew by name. A porch swing where Carol and I sat most evenings, saying very little, because after 40 years together, silence between two people can say more than any conversation. I never once, not for a single day of my adult life, considered that I would end up anywhere other than that ranch. I assumed I would die there, the same way my father had, the same way my grandfather had. I assumed Carol and I would grow old together on that porch, and that our children would eventually take over, the way I had taken over from my father. Life, as it turns out, does not consult you before rewriting your plans. In the spring of 2022, Carol started complaining of pain in her lower back that wouldn't go away no matter how she stretched or how many times I rubbed it out for her in the evenings. She was 70 at the time, and we both figured it was just age catching up, the same way my knees had started aching a few years before. She finally agreed to see Dr. Ramirez in town, mostly because I nagged her about it for 3 straight weeks. The tests came back in June. Pancreatic cancer, already at stage 3. I remember sitting in that small office in Lubbock holding Carol's hand and feeling like the floor of the entire world had simply given out beneath us. Dr. Ramirez was kind but honest. He didn't sugarcoat the odds because Carol had always told him she wanted the truth, no matter how hard it was to hear. What followed were 8 months that I will never fully be able to describe to anyone who hasn't lived through something similar. Chemotherapy that left her too weak to walk to the mailbox some days. Trips to the specialist in Amarillo, 90 minutes each way, that I made more times than I could count. I sold off 40 head of cattle just to cover the parts our insurance didn't, and I would have sold every single cow on that ranch without a second thought if it meant 1 more month with her. I became her full-time caretaker in those final months, on top of running what was left of the ranch. I learned to manage her medications, to recognize the days she needed rest versus the days she needed to be pushed gently outside for fresh air. I learned to hold her hair back when the nausea hit, to change bandages, to sit beside a hospital bed we'd installed in what used to be our dining room. Reading to her from books she loved because reading on her own had become too tiring for her eyes. Wade Jr. came by when he could, but he had his own job and his own family 40 minutes away. Emily flew in twice from Colorado, staying a week each time, crying in the kitchen where she thought I couldn't hear her. But the day-to-day of it, the 3 a.m. medication schedules, the moments of fear in her eyes that she tried to hide from everyone but me, that fell to me, and only me. Nobody else could have carried it, and honestly, I wouldn't have wanted anyone else to. 44 years of marriage had taught me that taking care of Carol was simply part of who I was. Carol passed away in February of 2023, in our home in the bed we'd shared for over 4 decades, with my hand in hers. She was 71 years old. I was 66. I don't know how to properly explain the silence that moves into a house after someone like Carol leaves it. It isn't just quiet. It's a presence of its own, heavy, physical, sitting in every room like an unwelcome guest that refuses to leave no matter how many lights you turn on or how loud you play the radio. For the first few months, I kept the ranch running on pure muscle memory because I genuinely didn't know what else to do with my hands or my mornings. I'd wake at 5, same as always, and for one confused half-second before full consciousness arrived, I'd reach over to Carol's side of the bed. Then I'd remember. Every single morning I remembered all over again, and every single morning it hurt exactly the same amount as the first time. My son called every Sunday dutifully. My daughter called more often, usually crying by the end of the conversation, which I understood, but which also exhausted me in ways I felt too guilty to admit. Neighbors brought casseroles for the first month, then slowly stopped. The way people do, not out of cruelty, but because life moves on for everyone, except the person left standing in the wreckage. My knees, which had been complaining for a decade, started genuinely failing me. 44 years of ranch work does something to a man's joints that no amount of ibuprofen can fully fix. Hauling feed, mending fences, working cattle through the chutes, tasks I'd done 10,000 times without thinking twice, started taking twice as long and hurting 3 times as much. I hired a 19-year-old named Tyler to help part-time, but paying him, on top of everything else, started eating into savings that were already thinner than I let anyone know. And here's the truth I didn't want to admit to my children, to my neighbors, or even fully to myself. I was drowning. Not just emotionally, though that was certainly true. Financially, too. The ranch that had sustained 3 generations of McAllisters could no longer sustain one tired, grieving 66-year-old widower with bad knees and a heart that felt hollowed out. It took me nearly a year to admit out loud what I'd known privately for months. I needed to sell. I remember the conversation with Wade Jr. like it happened yesterday. We were standing by the north fence, the one his great-grandfather had built by hand, and I told him I was thinking about selling the ranch. He went quiet for a long moment, the same kind of quiet Carol used to get when she was upset, but trying not to show it. "Dad, this land has been in our family for almost 100 years, he said. "I know it has, son. I know better than anyone. You really think you can just walk away from it?" I didn't have a good answer for him that day. All I could say was that my body couldn't do the work anymore, and my heart couldn't stay in a house that echoed with Carol's absence in every single room. He didn't fully understand. How could he at 42, with his own healthy wife and 2 kids and a steady salary? Grief like mine isn't something you can hand someone secondhand and expect them to feel its full weight. Emily was gentler about it on the phone, but just as uncertain. "Dad, are you sure you're thinking clearly? This is such a big decision to make so soon after Mom." That comment stuck with me longer than I wanted it to. Because the truth was, nobody, not my son, not my daughter, actually asked me what I wanted. They asked whether I was thinking clearly, which is a very different question. It's the kind of question that assumes the person asking already knows the correct answer and is simply waiting for you to arrive at it yourself. Nobody sat me down and said, "Dad, what do you actually want the rest of your life to look like?" And if they had, I'm not even sure I would have had an answer ready. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that I did not want to spend whatever years I had left rattling around an empty ranch house, managing a business I could no longer physically run, surrounded by memories that ambushed me in every room, every morning, every single day. I listed the ranch in the spring of 2024. It sold in 11 weeks to a larger cattle operation, looking to expand, for a price that felt both enormous and, somehow, entirely insufficient. After paying off the last of our debts, including 2 hospital bills that had lingered since Carol's treatment, I was left with a sum of money that, on paper, looked like a small fortune to a man who'd never had more than a few $1,000s in savings at any point in his life. But then I sat down with a financial planner in Lubbock, a careful, soft-spoken man named Gary, who ran the numbers for me on a laptop while I sipped bad coffee in his office. Social Security, the proceeds from the land, a modest 401k I'd barely paid attention to over the years, Gary laid it all out plainly. If I stayed in Texas, if I bought even a modest house in town and tried to maintain anything resembling the standard of living Carol and I had built together, the money wouldn't last. Not with rising property taxes. Not with health insurance premiums that seemed to climb every single year, regardless of what the politicians promised. Not with the cost of everything from groceries to gasoline creeping upward the way it had these past few years. "Jim," Gary told me, taking off his glasses in that way people do right before they say something you don't want to hear, "you did everything right your whole life, but the math just doesn't work the way it used to. If you stay here, you're going to have to cut your standard of living by more than half. Maybe live somewhere much smaller. Maybe rely on your kids more than you'd probably like." Rely on my kids. Those 3 words hit me harder than almost anything else in that entire conversation. I had spent my entire life being the one people relied on. Carol, my children, half the ranchers in the county who needed their tractors fixed on a Saturday afternoon. The idea of becoming a burden, of needing my son or daughter to help cover my bills or, worse, to move me into their home someday, felt like a small death all its own, layered right on top of the very large one I was already grieving. It was my old friend Robert, the same Robert who'd dragged me to that county fair 46 years earlier, where I first met Carol, who planted the seed that would eventually change everything. Robert had served in the Air Force for 20 years, stationed at various points around the world, and he'd developed a habit late in life of researching places where a modest American retirement income could stretch a whole lot further than it did back home. We were sitting on his back porch one evening, drinking sweet tea, and I was telling him about my conversation with Gary, about the math that simply didn't add up anymore. "You ever think about just leaving the country, Jim?" he asked, completely out of nowhere. I laughed, genuinely thinking he was joking. "Leaving the country? Robert, I've never even had a passport." "I'm serious," he said. "I've been looking into it myself, Costa Rica, Panama, Mexico. But the place that keeps coming up, the place with the best numbers by far, is the Philippines." He pulled out his phone right there on the porch and started showing me videos. American retirees, most of them around my age, walking along beaches in a place called Cebu, showing off apartments with ocean views that cost less per month than my property taxes alone had cost back home. Men my age with full-time household help, private health care that cost a fraction of American premiums, and, most strikingly to me, communities of expatriates who seemed genuinely happy, genuinely connected to each other in a way I hadn't felt from anyone besides Carol in longer than I wanted to admit. "They've got a retirement visa," Robert explained. "Special Resident Retirees Visa, they call it. Anybody over 50 can apply. You put a bit of money into a Philippine bank account, and you get to stay indefinitely. My cousin's neighbor did it 2 years back, says it's the best decision he ever made." I told Robert he was crazy. I told him a 68-year-old, because that's what I was by then. Texas rancher who'd never left the country in his entire life, had no business moving to some island on the other side of the planet, where he didn't know a single soul and couldn't speak a word of the language. But that night, lying alone in a bed that still somehow smelled faintly of Carol, even a year and a half after she'd gone, I found myself pulling up my own laptop and typing, "Americans retiring in the Philippines," into the search bar. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself it wouldn't hurt to look. I looked until nearly 4 in the morning. What started as one curious night turned into 3 months of a habit I didn't tell anyone about. Not Wade Jr., not Emily, not even Robert, though he'd been the one to plant the idea in the first place. I'd finish my evening chores, eat a simple dinner alone at the kitchen table, and then sit up until the small hours of the morning reading everything I could find. Expat forums where retirees compared notes on visa paperwork and the best neighborhoods in Cebu. YouTube channels run by American and European retirees who filmed their daily lives, trips to the local market, conversations with Filipino neighbors, tours of modest but comfortable homes with monthly rents that seemed almost fictional compared to what things cost back in Texas. I made spreadsheets. I've always been a numbers man. You don't run a ranch for 40 years without learning to track every dollar in and out. And I applied that same discipline to this strange new obsession. I compared the cost of a one-bedroom apartment in Cebu City to the cost of a modest house in Lubbock. I compared the price of private health insurance for a 68-year-old American in the Philippines to the premiums Gary had quoted me for staying in Texas. I compared the cost of hiring a full-time housekeeper in Cebu, which I discovered with genuine disbelief, ran somewhere around $150 a month, to what it would cost me to hire even part-time help back home. Every single number pointed in the same direction. My retirement funds, which Gary had told me wouldn't stretch more than a decade in Texas at anything close to a comfortable standard of living, would very likely last me the rest of my natural life in the Philippines, with room to spare for travel, for gifts to my grandkids, for the occasional splurge that Carol and I had never quite been able to afford, even in our best years. But the numbers weren't really what kept me up until 4 in the morning, night after night. It was the faces in those videos. Retirees my age, and older, who looked genuinely content in a way I hadn't seen much of back home, even before Carol got sick. They talked about neighbors who checked in on them daily, about small kindnesses from strangers, about a warmth in everyday interactions that several of them said reminded them of a version of America that had existed decades ago, but seemed to have quietly disappeared. I found myself especially drawn to the story of a man named Frank, a retired schoolteacher from Ohio, 71 years old, who'd lost his own wife 2 years before making the move. In one video, sitting on a porch not unlike the one Carol and I used to share, Frank said something that I rewound and watched at least a dozen times. "I didn't move here to run away from my grief. I moved here because I realized grief doesn't need a specific zip code to follow you around. I figured if I was going to carry it with me anyway, I might as well carry it somewhere the sun was warm and the people were kind." I didn't sleep much that night, but for the first time in 18 months, what kept me awake wasn't grief alone. It was something that felt, cautiously, almost like hope. I finally worked up the nerve to tell Wade Jr. over a Sunday phone call in early autumn. I remember how my hands actually shook slightly as I dialed, which struck me as absurd. I was a grown man, a rancher who'd faced down droughts and dying cattle and a dozen other hardships without so much as flinching, and yet telling my own son about a decision I'd made for myself had me more nervous than anything in years. "Dad, are you feeling okay?" he asked, once I'd finished explaining. "I'm feeling fine, son. Better than I have in a long while, actually." "You want to move to the Philippines, by yourself, at 68. "That's right." There was a long pause on the line. "Dad, no offense, but you've never even been to Mexico. You get lost driving to Amarillo sometimes. How exactly do you plan on navigating an entire country on the other side of the world?" I understood his concern, even as it stung. He wasn't entirely wrong. I was a homebody by nature, a man who found comfort in routine and familiarity. But what he didn't say, what none of my family said explicitly, even though I felt it underneath every conversation, was any real curiosity about what I actually wanted, about what might genuinely make the back half of my life feel worth living. Instead, it was worry dressed up as concern for my well-being, which I understood came from love, but which also somehow made me feel smaller rather than supported. "Wade," I told him, "your mother and I built a whole life by taking risks other people thought were foolish. Your great-grandfather bought worthless dirt during the Dust Bowl because he believed he could make something of it. I think I've got at least that much of his stubbornness left in me." Emily's reaction when I called her that same evening was gentler but carried its own version of the same undertone. "Dad, I just want to make sure you're not making a decision out of grief. Sometimes people do drastic things when they're not thinking straight. Emily, I've spent 3 months studying every number, every visa requirement, every neighborhood in that city. I've thought this through more carefully than almost any decision I've made in my life, maybe outside of marrying your mother." She softened after that, though I could still hear the worry humming underneath her voice like a live wire. "Just promise me you'll video call every week, and that you'll come back if it's terrible." I promised her both things, and I meant them. But I also understood in that quiet moment after we hung up that this was a decision I needed to make for myself, the way I'd made every major decision of my adult life, carefully, deliberately, and ultimately alone, even when the people I loved were standing right beside me. Once I'd made my decision final, the practical work of dismantling 68 years of American life began. I sold my truck, a 2009 Ford F-25. I'd owned since it rolled off the lot. The same truck I'd used to drive Carol to every single one of her chemotherapy appointments in Amarillo. Selling it felt like severing one more thread connecting me to the life we'd built together. But I told myself, standing in that dealership parking lot with the keys in my palm one last time, that Carol would have wanted me to stop clinging to objects and start clinging to whatever came next. I kept very little from the house. A few photographs. Carol's wedding ring, which I now wear on a chain around my neck rather than on my finger. Her favorite quilt, the one her own grandmother had made decades earlier. Everything else, the furniture we'd chosen together, the dishes we'd used for 4 decades of Sunday dinners, the tools that had belonged to my father and grandfather before him. I either sold, donated to the church, or gave to Wade Jr. and Emily to split between them, along with whatever pieces of family history they wanted to keep. I applied for my very first passport at 68 years old, standing in line at the post office in Lubbock, behind a young mother renewing hers for a family vacation to Cancun. I applied for the Special Resident Retiree's visa through a Philippine agency Robert had recommended, depositing the required funds into a designated bank account, gathering medical clearances, filling out more paperwork than I'd completed in the entire process of buying the ranch decades earlier. I remember signing the final visa documents at my kitchen table, the same table where Carol and I had eaten 10,000 meals together, where I'd fed her broth during her final months, where I now sat completely alone finalizing a decision that would take me 8,000 miles from everything I'd ever known. I remember thinking, quite clearly, if this goes wrong, I can always come home. But at least I'll know I tried. I bought a one-way ticket to Cebu. Not round trip. One way. Something about that felt important, a commitment I needed to make to myself, even if I secretly kept the return option open in the back of my mind, just in case. The flight itself was a small ordeal for a man who'd never once been on an airplane longer than the hour-long hop from Lubbock to Dallas. 16 hours of travel, 2 layovers, a body that ached in places I didn't know could ache from sitting still for so long. I remember staring out the small oval window somewhere over the Pacific, watching absolutely nothing but dark ocean stretch endlessly below, and feeling a wave of doubt so strong it nearly made me physically sick. What in God's name was I doing? A 68-year-old widower, a man who'd never left Texas in his entire life, flying alone toward a country where he knew not one single living person, where he couldn't read a single street sign, where every single thing that had ever felt familiar was now 8,000 miles behind him. I landed in Cebu in the late afternoon, and the heat hit me the moment the plane doors opened, a thick, wet, tropical heat completely unlike the dry, cracking heat of a West Texas summer. The airport was loud, crowded, full of languages I couldn't understand, colors and smells that overwhelmed senses I hadn't realized had grown so accustomed to the quiet monotony of ranch life. I had arranged, through the same agency that helped with my visa, for a driver to meet me. A young man named Marco stood near the arrivals gate, holding a small handwritten sign that read, Mr. Jim, and something about seeing my own name, even misspelled slightly, held up by a complete stranger in this overwhelming new place, brought tears to my eyes right there in the middle of the terminal. It was, I realized later, the first time in longer than I could remember that someone had seemed genuinely happy simply to be receiving me. Marco helped me load my 2 suitcases. Everything I owned in the world now fit into 2 suitcases, into his car, and as we drove from the airport toward the apartment I'd arranged to rent for my first month, I stared out the window at a world that looked nothing like anything I'd ever known. Motorbikes weaving between cars with an ease that seemed almost choreographed. Street vendors selling fruits I couldn't name. Buildings painted in colors no self-respecting Texan would ever paint a house. Children playing in the streets, laughing, waving at the car as we passed. I remember Marco glancing at me in the rearview mirror and asking in careful English, "First time in Philippines, sir?" "First time anywhere, really," I told him, and he laughed. Not unkindly, but warmly, the way you'd laugh at an old friend's charming confession, rather than a stranger's admission of foolishness. I won't pretend the first few weeks were easy. They were, in fact, some of the hardest weeks I'd experienced since the months of Carol's final decline. I missed my truck. I missed the particular silence of a Texas evening, so different from the layered symphony of sounds outside my new apartment window. Roosters at impossibly early hours, motorbikes, distant music, voices in a language I couldn't understand carrying up from the street below. I missed knowing instinctively how everything worked, where to buy groceries, how to pay a bill, what the unspoken rules of a place were. Here, I was a child again in almost every practical sense, having to relearn things I'd taken for granted my entire adult life. I ate alone most nights, the same way I had in Texas after Carol passed, except now even ordering food required pointing helplessly at a menu and hoping for the best. I remember one particularly low evening, about 10 days in, sitting in my rented apartment eating a meal I hadn't fully understood I'd ordered, when the loneliness hit me so hard I actually called Emily crying, something I hadn't done since the week of her mother's funeral. "Dad, if it's this hard, just come home," she said gently. "I'm not ready to give up yet," I told her, though in that particular moment I wasn't entirely sure I believed my own words. But something happened over those first difficult weeks that I hadn't expected. And it happened in small moments, rather than one dramatic turning point. A fruit vendor near my apartment, an older woman everyone called Nanay Rosa, began greeting me by name after only my third visit to her stall, patiently teaching me the Bisaya words for mango and banana and pineapple, laughing warmly at my terrible pronunciation without a trace of mockery in it. A neighbor named Elena, a woman about my own age who lived 2 doors down, knocked on my door one Sunday with a plate of homemade food, pancit and lumpia, dishes I'd never tasted before, simply because, as she explained in careful English, "You are new here. New people should not eat alone on Sunday." I remember standing in my doorway holding that plate of food, overwhelmed by an emotion I couldn't fully name at the time, but now recognize clearly as the earliest, most fragile seed of belonging. Nobody back in Texas, no offense meant to the good, kind people I'd known my entire life, had ever shown up on my doorstep simply because it seemed wrong for a new person to eat alone. Not because Texans lack kindness, they don't, but there was something different here, something about a culture that seemed to place community and hospitality at its very center in a way that felt, to a lonely 68-year-old widower, like water in a desert he hadn't realized he'd been dying of thirst in. Slowly, over the following 2 months, I began building something that resembled a life again. I hired a housekeeper, a soft-spoken, endlessly patient woman named Marites, who came recommended by my landlord. She cooks for me most days now, keeps my small apartment spotless, and has become, in a way I never anticipated, something like family. She scolds me gently when I skip meals out of laziness, the same way Carol used to. She taught me to eat rice with nearly every meal, and though I resisted at first, a proud Texan raised on beef and potatoes, I now genuinely crave the simple comfort of a bowl of garlic rice the way I once craved my mother's cornbread. I began attending a weekly gathering of expatriates, mostly American and European retirees, though a few Australians and Canadians as well, that meets every Friday evening at a small open-air restaurant near the water. Robert's cousin's neighbor, the man who'd first inspired Robert's own research, turned out to be part of this exact group, and he welcomed me warmly the very first evening I showed up, nervous and unsure of myself, not knowing a single face in the crowd. That group has become, in the months since, something close to what my old poker buddies were back in Lubbock, except perhaps even richer in a strange way, because everyone in that group had made the same enormous leap I had left behind everything familiar to build something new in the second half of their lives. We share stories of our old lives back home, our grief, our fears, our small victories in learning to navigate an entirely new culture. Frank, the retired Ohio schoolteacher whose video had kept me up until 4 a.m. all those months earlier, turned out to actually be part of this very group, and meeting him in person, shaking his hand, telling him how his words had helped nudge me toward this decision, remains one of the most meaningful conversations I've had since Carol passed. I started taking Bisaya lessons twice a week from a young university student named Angel, who patiently corrects my mangled pronunciation with far more grace than a stubborn old Texan probably deserves. I can now hold a basic conversation at the market, order food without pointing helplessly at pictures, and greet my neighbors properly in their own language, which never fails to bring a genuine smile to their faces. I'd be lying if I said the financial relief wasn't a significant part of what has made this new chapter feel sustainable. My one-bedroom apartment, a short walk from the beach, cost me roughly $400 a month, a fraction of what even a modest house in Texas would cost in mortgage or rent alone. Marites, my housekeeper, cost me around $150 a month for daily service, an expense that would have been entirely unthinkable back in Lubbock, where hiring even part-time household help ran into the thousands. My private health insurance here costs less than a quarter of what Gary had quoted me for staying in Texas, and the private hospital I've used twice for minor issues, a bout of food poisoning my first month, and a checkup for my aching knees, provided care that felt more attentive and personal than anything I'd experienced from the American healthcare system in years, at a fraction of the cost. For the first time since Carol's diagnosis, I sleep through the night without lying awake calculating whether my savings will outlast me. Gary, whom I still consult by video call every few months out of habit, ran the updated numbers for me recently and told me, somewhat astonished, that at my current cost of living, my retirement funds would very likely outlast me by a comfortable margin, even accounting for inflation and the occasional splurge. That financial peace has given me something I hadn't expected: room to actually grieve properly, rather than grieving while simultaneously drowning in anxiety about bills and dwindling savings. I've been able to travel to nearby islands, Bohol, with its strange chocolate-colored hills, and Palawan, with water so clear it looked almost unreal to a man raised on the muddy stock tanks of West Texas. I've been able to send money home for my grandchildren's birthdays without a second thought, something that would have required careful budgeting back in Texas. Wade Jr. flew out to visit me this past spring, nearly a year after I'd first arrived. I picked him up from the airport myself now, having learned to navigate the local transportation with a confidence that would have astonished the nervous, jet-lagged man who'd stumbled off that plane 12 months earlier. I watched my son's face as we drove from the airport. The same overwhelmed expression I'm sure I'd worn myself that first day, taking in the motorbikes and the colors and the unfamiliar rhythm of a place he'd been quietly convinced, for the better part of a year, that his father had lost his mind by moving to. Over the course of his 5-day visit, I watched something shift in him. He met Marites, who fussed over him the way she fusses over me, feeding him more food than any reasonable person should eat in a single sitting. He came with me to the Friday gathering, met Frank and Robert's cousin's neighbor, and half a dozen other retirees who'd made this same enormous leap, and listened to their stories with an expression that gradually softened from skepticism into something like understanding. On his last night, we sat together on the small balcony of my apartment, looking out at a sky full of stars far brighter than anything visible through Lubbock's ambient light, and he said something I don't think I'll ever forget. "Dad, I'm sorry. I spent a whole year thinking you'd lost it, but you didn't lose anything. You found something. I just wish I'd asked you, back when you first brought it up, what you actually wanted, instead of just telling you what I thought was safe." I told him there was nothing to apologize for, that grief makes everyone around it clumsy and afraid, and that his worry had only ever come from love, even when it felt more like doubt. But I'll admit, hearing him finally say those words, finally seeing the decision through my eyes rather than through the lens of his own fear, meant more to me than almost anything else that's happened since I arrived here. He cried before he boarded his flight home, something I'd only seen him do once before, at his mother's funeral. "I'm proud of you, Dad," he said. "I don't think I could have done what you did." "You'd be surprised what you're capable of, son, when the alternative is simply giving up," I told him. And I meant every word of it. I spent 68 years believing that growing old with dignity meant staying exactly where you were planted, gritting your teeth through whatever hardship came your way, never asking for help, never admitting that the life you'd built might no longer fit the person you'd become. That was the McAllister way. My grandfather lived it. My father lived it. I fully expected to live it too, right up until the day I died on that same dusty ranch. It took losing Carol, and then very nearly losing myself in the silence that followed, to teach me something different. That dignity isn't always found in staying. Sometimes it's found in admitting, honestly and without shame, that the life you built has finished doing what it was meant to do, and that there might be room, even at 68, even alone, even terrified, to build something entirely new. I think about Carol often here, more than I expected to, if I'm honest. I thought moving to the other side of the world might somehow dull the grief, might put enough distance between me and our shared history that the pain would finally loosen its grip. That isn't quite what happened. The grief came with me, the way Frank had warned me it would in that very first video I watched all those months ago. But here, in this strange, warm, unexpectedly welcoming place, I've found that grief doesn't have to be the only thing keeping me company anymore. I found room alongside it for genuine friendship, genuine curiosity, even genuine joy, feelings I honestly wasn't sure I had access to anymore after watching her fade in that hospital bed in what used to be our dining room. I still keep her wedding ring on the chain around my neck. I still talk to her some evenings, sitting on my small balcony, telling her about my day the way I used to on our porch back home. I like to think she'd be proud of me, not necessarily for moving to the Philippines specifically, but for refusing to let her death be the end of my own story. She always did tell me I was too stubborn to know when to quit. Turns out that same stubbornness, the very thing that once kept me chained to a dying way of life out of pure loyalty to tradition, was exactly what it took to build a new one when the old one no longer served me. I'm 69 years old now, writing this from a small balcony overlooking the water in Cebu, roughly 18 months after I first arrived, not knowing a single soul. Marites is inside preparing dinner, humming to herself the way she always does. I have a Friday gathering to look forward to tonight, old friends now rather than strangers, men and women who understand exactly what it costs and what it gives to start over this late in life. I have a video call scheduled with Emily tomorrow, and another visit from Wade Jr. planned for the holidays, this time bringing his whole family along to meet Marites and Robert's cousin's neighbor and the small, unlikely community I've built for myself here. I still miss Texas some days. I still miss the particular smell of rain on dry West Texas dirt, the sound of cattle in the early morning, the porch swing where Carol and I sat in comfortable silence for 4 decades. That life was real, and it mattered, and I don't regret a single year of it, but I no longer believe that growing old with dignity means staying frozen in a life that no longer fits, simply because it's the life you've always known. Sometimes dignity looks exactly like what everyone around you insists is recklessness. Sometimes the biggest risk of your life turns out to be the very thing that saves it. If you find yourself like I did, standing in the wreckage of a life you thought would look one particular way forever, wondering whether it's too late to build something different, I want you to know that it isn't. I was 68 years old. I'd never left the country. I just buried the only woman I ever loved. And somehow on the other side of the world, in a place I once couldn't have found on a map, I found a reason to keep living, fully and gratefully, rather than simply enduring whatever years I had left. Carol used to say that the best decisions in life rarely feel safe in the moment you're making them. I didn't fully understand what she meant until I found myself standing in that airport in Cebu, terrified, alone, and further from home than I'd ever imagined I'd be. But it was, without question, the best decision I ever made.